The situation in Libya is seriously deteriorating. It's much harder on civilians these days. More civilians are being killed. It's taking on the characteristics of a civil war, although I don't think I would characterize it yet as a civil war. But certainly there is a growing humanitarian crisis. It's not what it was, it's worse. And in that context, the call for a no-fly zone to be established, the call for somebody do something, is becoming louder, and it's in a certain way harder to answer, because the humanitarian reality is a disaster. There is a need that's very real, and the people calling for it are desperate. The problem, I think, is that we don't really have a government for whom, and I don't think this is particular to the US, I would say that there's not a government in the world for whom humanitarian concerns of another people will actually ever lead to a strategic commitment of major resources, certainly not the commitment of armed forces. So that's what we're really dealing with. If there were to be a no-fly zone established by the United States, or by NATO, or by some, quote, coalition involving the US and Britain or other countries that have been pushing even harder, Britain and France the lead at the moment, we would be in a situation where the decision-making to make that decision would not have been based on the humanitarian crisis. It simply doesn't work that way. On the other hand, the opposition is showing itself in the last couple of days to be somewhat more skilled, have more access to weapons, but they still are massively outgunned by the Gaddafi forces, who have in the last day or two been using greater force than they were earlier. Still, there's no indication that they're using everything they have. There are still indications that pilots that are conducting bombing raids are perhaps deliberately, perhaps out of incompetence, but are dropping their bombs away from the apparent or likely target in the areas where they were. That doesn't mean that there's yet an equal fight between two equally armed sides, but it does mean that the opposition is fighting back on a strong military basis. I think that the calls from the Libyan opposition forces, the political folks speaking in their name, and it's a very amorphous opposition. It isn't yet coherent. It's not yet able to speak with one voice. Over the last few days, that voice has been overwhelmingly with calls for a no-fly zone. Some of the leaders who early on expressed a very strong opposition, including Abdel Hafid Goga, who is still the spokesman for the council in Benghazi. He was the first one to say, we are against any foreign intervention, and he was including a no-fly zone at that time. Whether he and others have changed their mind isn't clear. Whether they are simply being silent isn't clear. So all of the questions about who's asking for a no-fly zone remain somewhat ambiguous. The problem is all of the calls, all of them, have specified we want a no-fly zone, but we don't want military intervention, as if you could have one without the other. And the problem with that, the reason that you can't, is that establishing a no-fly zone doesn't work if the anti-aircraft guns of the other side are already hugely powerful and are on the ground and capable of taking out the planes as they begin to establish and enforce this no-fly zone. So the first act of establishing a no-fly zone is to, quote, take out the anti-aircraft guns. That means bombing. That means another act of war. It means bombing Libya. So the notion that you can somehow have this no-fly zone and yet not have a military intervention simply doesn't work in terms of what a no-fly zone is. A no-fly zone is an act of war. And by itself, it brings with it the serious danger of more civilian casualties, as well as the broad danger of furthering, escalating the militarization of an already over-militarized conflict. The particular, if we look at history, if we look at the Iraq no-fly zone, for instance, which was, of course, established unilaterally by Britain and the US, with France for a brief time, and then they pulled out, but crucially, without UN approval, despite the direct lies of President Clinton, who said over and over again, our no-fly zone is enforcing a UN resolution. And I always wanted to be at one of the press conferences and say, excuse me, Mr. President, excuse me, could you tell me exactly which resolution it was that you're enforcing? because of course there never was a UN Security Council resolution imposing a no-fly zone. The irony, of course, is right now, President Clinton's wife, Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State, is saying the right thing. For whatever hypocritical or double standard reasons, it's still good, she's saying it, that if there is to be any kind of military involvement, including a no-fly zone, it must be on the basis of a UN Security Council decision. I'm glad somebody finally got to them and taught them that lesson. But there's also the question of civilian casualties. In Iraq, that no-fly zone was imposed for over 12 years. And the UN documented the civilian casualties. 1 year alone, the year 1999, right in the middle of that period, 144 civilians were killed by bombs dropped by the US and the British planes to enforce that no-fly zone. They were not killed by Saddam Hussein's brutality. They were killed by the US no-fly zone. There's absolutely no reason to think that it wouldn't happen again. If we talk about the so-called targeted airstrikes, that would be the precursor to a no-fly zone, taking out the military targets, taking out these surface-to-air missiles or whatever it is they have, the anti-aircraft guns. We just have to look at what the US did back in 1986, where again, the US said we are going to use targeted airstrikes, surgical airstrikes. This time it was in retaliation against Gaddafi, who was blamed for a terrorist action in Germany at the same time. And the US went in and attacked military targets in Benghazi and in Tripoli. And they got some military targets. They got one of Gaddafi's homes or his centers. They didn't kill him, he wasn't there. His 3-year-old daughter was there, she was killed. Over 100 civilians were killed in those bombing raids, one of which hit a heavily populated suburb of Tripoli. Again, there's no reason to think it's going to be any different in terms of the humanitarian cost, the direct cost in civilian casualties. So finally, the question of why is it that there's even this discussion underway? It's significantly too simplistic, I think, to say this is all about oil. US oil interests, British and French and Italian oil companies, all the European oil companies were doing just fine with Gaddafi in control. Since 2003, when Gaddafi came in from the cold, as they like to say, when he agreed to dismantle his nuclear program in return for diplomatic and economic rehabilitation in the world, he has had tight relations with the oil companies of all the Western countries. Less so with the US, not out of any choice on his part, he was open to it, but by the choice of the US. Italy, the UK, British Petroleum was one of the major forces in the Libyan oil industry. So it's not just about oil, although that's always a consideration in an oil-rich state. It's also about the politics of the new Middle East. The Libyan uprising, although it's taken a very different, much more dangerous turn, it began in the context of a region-wide escalation of democracy, an escalation of uprisings across the region. The Libyan model was no different at the beginning. Now it's a very different scenario, but it's in that context that the US is looking at who's going to be in power after Gaddafi. It's clear he's not going to be continuing. We have to be on the good side of history. In that case, the good side of whoever comes to power. If we can present ourselves, if we can posture as being the only ones, or the leading ones, or the best ones, or the strongest ones, who were willing and able to provide the exact military protection that people are calling for, won't that position us very well with this new government? That's the cynical reality of what stands at the root of this debate. It's not, unfortunately, about protecting civilian lives.